Welcome to our first afternoon panel, which will be chaired by my friend and colleague Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic. Our subject is geopolitics, realism, idealism, Eurasianism. I wanted to make one simple housekeeping announcement before we listen. Please be quiet. You care about this. This is very important to your future. I want to make one simple practical announcement. There is a reception after the last panel today. So we have this panel, we have a coffee break, then we have a panel on totalitarianism. After that panel, there is a reception. And everyone who sits through the panels is invited to the reception, right? If you do not sit through the panels, if you are watching on TV, you are not invited to the reception. But everyone who is here, you are invited to the reception. And to come to the reception, all you have to do is go out the front door, turn right, walk for 50 meters, and go through the front door of the Intercontinental. In the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental Hotel is the reception, after the Polish language panel on totalitarianism. Okay, so with that practical announcement, I'm going to hand over to Leon. We're going to have one more word of a less practical nature, and then we will begin our discussion. Leon.
Thank you, Tim. Before we begin, we're going to begin a little bit differently today. I want to ask a young woman named Anna Kuzina to come up to speak for a few minutes about the very outrageous case of the two detained individuals in Slovyansk, Pavel Yurov and Denis Hryschuk.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Анна Кузина, я актриса, и буквально 2 минуты вашего времени. Уже больше 3 недель наши друзья Павел Юров и Денис Грищук содержатся в заложниках в Славянске на востоке Украины. С 25 апреля с ними нет никакой связи, и мы уже обращались во все инстанции, в милицию, в СБУ, но никакой реакции. И, пожалуйста, если вы можете помочь... Вот есть адреса, моя коллега Кристина, вот она в конце зала, после окончания мероприятия можно обратиться за дополнительной информацией. Вот очень надеемся на вашу помощь, потому что мы уже не знаем, куда обращаться и что делать. По нашей информации ребята живы, вот, но почему-то ничего не происходит. Спасибо.
Good afternoon. We're going to expand the framework of the discussion a little bit now in speaking about geopolitics. We've talked a lot about Ukraine, internal Ukrainian realities, political, cultural, social. We've talked about Ukraine and Russia. We've talked about Russia. We've talked about Europe. Now we're basically going to go global for a little bit and talk about geopolitics. We're going to try to cast some light on what the Ukrainian crisis means for other states and regions, and at the same instance, of course, to cast some light on what might be the appropriate or desirable or inevitable response of other states to the events that are taking place here. The assumption being that this is a serious crisis, and a serious crisis requires a serious response. The response must be commensurate with the crisis. Putin has violated international norms and international law in a variety of ways. He has annexed, or rather stolen, Crimea. He has not just destabilized, or rather he has destabilized Ukraine by means of an unconventional invasion of the country. This is, by any meaning of the words, an assault on the world order, on the post-war world order and on the post-Soviet world order. And such an attack on the world order, however we define this world order, has enormous implications, not only for Ukraine, but beyond. It raises fundamental questions of the responsibilities of states toward other states, and the responsibilities of states in what we might call moral emergencies. And we can discuss what a moral emergency might consist in. People back home or in the West sometimes talk now about the return of geopolitics, mainly as a consequence of Putin's aggression. But of course, geopolitics never went away. Putin has been practicing geopolitics for years. He practiced geopolitics in Georgia, he practiced it in South Ossetia, and so on. What happened was that some people in the West, for various reasons, you may like the reasons, you may not like the reasons, preferred not to notice geopolitics, or preferred to believe in the obsolescence of geopolitics, and preferred not to practice geopolitics in some way. But we're here to talk about what the practice of geopolitics might be like in the aftermath of this crisis and of Putin's expansionist idea of Russia. In the analysis of foreign policy, and these are very coarse terms, and all my friends on the panel are going to complicate them and correct them and so on. In the analysis of foreign policy, one speaks often about values and interests, and the attempt is made to find some way to balance values and interests in the foreign policy of certain states, to consider when values might trump interests, when interests might trump values. There are crises in foreign policy that broach interests, but not necessarily values. There are some that broach values and not necessarily interests. For example, the genocide in Rwanda would have been an example of that. And in discussing geopolitics, one of the things I'd like us to consider is the place of values and interests in the formulation of diplomacy and foreign policy. Or to put it differently, what should be the role of moral considerations in foreign policy? When one speaks of interests, the interests are strategic, but they're also economic. And in the discussion of responses, European responses, American responses, Western responses to the Ukrainian crisis, one hears mainly about the importance of economic interests. And so I would like to ask today a somewhat naive and heretical question, which is, are economic considerations really to be allowed to have the last word? Aren't there, do political, social, cultural, geopolitical problems all have economic solutions? When do strategic interests trump economic interests? And when do moral obligations trump economic interests? So we will talk a little bit about that. We will talk a little bit about contemporary diplomacy and the present cult of Geneva. Geneva, as you know, in recent months has become the world capital of failure. And we will probably talk a little bit about what the conditions are for serious and successful negotiations. And are there some things that are non-negotiable and rightly non-negotiable? And what is the role of military power? There's that M word. What is the role of military power in creating the conditions for successful diplomacy? And finally, what we're going to talk about today, and before then on, this is my last remark, is something we haven't really discussed yet. We've talked a great deal about Europe for obvious reasons, but we haven't yet discussed the elephant in the room, or rather the elephant that is not in the room because the elephant would prefer not to be in the room, and that is the United States of America. And that is the role of the United States. There is a great deal to say about whether the American response to the Ukrainian crisis, and by the way, it's probably preferable not to call it a crisis, because a crisis it describes a short-term circumstance. This crisis is actually the beginning of a new era. This is the beginning of a new situation. And to think of it as a crisis may be not just melodramatizing it, but simplifying the intellectual and political task. The only country in the world that geopolitically has the power, whether it chooses to use it or not, and this is what we'll discuss, has the power to defend the world order that Putin has traduced and that historically has underwritten this world order and had a great role in creating this world order, is of course the United States. And the question hovering behind the entire discussion of geopolitics, I think, has to be, what should the American response to these events and more generally to Putin's new assertion of himself in Russia? What should that response be? In the States, people talk a lot about American decline. There's a great debate going on back home whether or not the United States is in decline. Something is certainly going on that could be called retrenchment. And the question we might consider in this discussion as well, and this will be my last charge to my friends on the panel, is if in fact we are living in a period of American retrenchment in the age of Obama and the Obama presidency, what are the implications of American retrenchment, not just for Ukraine, but what are the implications of American retrenchment for the new geopolitical picture that Putin has created? The terrible coincidence or the glaring contradiction of this particular moment geopolitically is that Vladimir Putin has become an ardent believer in intervention and Barack Obama is an ardent believer in non-intervention. And this coincidence of priorities, and again, I'm describing them, I'm not judging them, though I think you can guess what I think about it. But I'm describing them, this coincidence of inclinations, of geopolitical inclinations, is something that anyone who cares about the future of Ukraine and of this region has to begin to grapple with candidly. Okay, having said all that, I'm going to ask my friend Francois Hesburgh to begin. I just want to say that I'm going to ask my friends to speak for 5 minutes, and if they speak for much longer than 5 minutes, I'm going to behave in an unattractively undemocratic manner. So thank you very much, Francois.
Thank you for that Leninist standpoint. I'll speak exactly as long as you did. That's my definition of 5 minutes. No, seriously, geopolitics are indeed, I don't know whether this works. Is it working? Yeah, okay. Geopolitics are indeed back, but it's not back to the Cold War. It's back to the pre-Cold War. During the Cold War, there actually was a network of both international law and practice which governed to some extent the deadlock between the opposing blocs. This is no longer the case. The annexation of Crimea has exemplified the change. So think 18th century, think 19th century, that is a situation in which there is a weak or a weaker body of international law than has been the case in previous years, and much less of a common rule of the road than was the case during the Cold War or after the Cold War. But at the same time, there's a return to geopolitics under modern conditions, that is, with nuclear weapons. Russia is a nuclear power, and this naturally has a direct impact on what the West thinks it can get away with or not get away with in its own reactions to the crisis in this part of the world. Modern conditions also, of course, in terms of the role of cyber, which we saw in Crimea, the role of financial networking, and so on. That's my first point. Second point, Russia. I was in Russia, in Moscow, a month ago with a number of friends. Ivan Krastev was one of them. And we saw all sorts of very interesting people close to Putin or opposed to Putin, economists, strategists, and so on. And there was a commonality, not of objectives, of course, between the pro and the anti-Putin people, of course not, but a commonality of understanding on what was going on the analysis. And let me give a brief summary of what that commonality of analysis was. First of all, this is the end of the post-Cold War era. This is the end of the post-Soviet era. This is, to use Sergei Karaganov's piece a few days ago in London, this is the equivalent of Germany in the early 1930s turning its back on what used to be called in those days Erfüllungspolitik, that is the respect of the Versailles Treaty. This is Sergei Karaganov, an advisor of Putin, reaching the Godwin point, not a Western analyst who is jumping to the Godwin point. Secondly, no obvious sense of limits of how far Putin may go. If you ask the question, could something happen in Narva, you're not going to get a straight answer. And this is not simply because people are not going to reveal their strategies, but it's simply because they do not know. And that, of course, has implications for Western actions and reactions. Thirdly, Russia is not aiming primarily for eastern Ukraine. Russia, in the short run, is aiming for Ukraine, all of Ukraine. And in order to do so, it will do what it takes to ensure that the elections of the 25th of May will not lead to a stable and legitimate governance in Ukraine. That is what we were told a month ago. I'm not making a forecast. Fourthly, the Ukraine of the current Russian dream is no longer a Ukraine run by a fairly strong central government in Kiev, run by somebody like Yanukovych, but a disintegrated Ukraine. Think cantonalisation. And here I would agree with some of the words said by my compatriot Bernard-Henri Lévy. Disintegration of Ukraine. Lastly, on the economy. Well, first of all, Putin is not simply moving in order to promote what he sees as Russia's interests. There is a Putin value system. It's not our value system, but he has a value system. It's socially conservative, it's ideologically religious, it's real, and it has a direct material impact on what he does in Europe and what he does in the Middle East. And if you are in a value-driven and not only an interest-driven conflict, then economic aspects are not going to be of the essence. And that is something which I think has not been understood in Washington or many of the European capitals, or possibly also in Kiev. Last point, what is to be done? Studiljot. First of all, and here I would want to reinforce what you said, Leon, this is not a quote-unquote crisis. This is a long-standing crisis. This is going to take time. This is going to be a 10 to 20-year thing, not something which is going to be resolved in 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years. That means that we have to organize ourselves in the long run. None of us have done that for the time being, intellectually or practically. Secondly, you used the word seriousness. The Russians, Putin's Russians, they are серьезные люди. These are really serious people. They have a strong narrative. They think politically. They act coherently. These are deadly serious people. I don't think that we are deadly serious. When I see the way the Russian narrative is impacting German public opinion, I'm not talking about the government, or is impacting the French public opinion, not the government, once again, you know that we have a problem. The dominating narrative today in Europe, the battle of the narratives, is being won by the Russians. We had better think seriously. We need to think politically and not technically. We do not need Mario Montis, we need Churchills or de Gaulles. And we have plenty of Mario Montis, to use the name of somebody who is no longer in power, and we don't have any Churchill that I can recognize, neither in Ukraine nor outside of Ukraine. And in closing, I'm reaching the end of my allotted 5 minutes. Elements of a strategy. Simply bricks. I'm not going to pretend to elaborate a strategy, certainly not in this time frame, and it's going to take time to elaborate a sensible strategy in any case. But some of the bricks are, first of all, containment. Now, containment is the easy option for the West. We put more combat aircraft, more soldiers, more ships in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, to defend Article 5 NATO members. This is not great news for Ukraine. It does not resolve the Ukrainian issue. But of course, it is an absolute necessity for the Western countries, because if we are not able to demonstrate seriousness in defending even ourselves, there is little chance that we're going to be able to convince Putin that we're going to be serious about dealing with Ukraine. Second element, what we do in support of Ukraine. Well, I said this is going to last a long time. And that is another way of saying that when things last a long time, we have to take into account that we're not going to win all of the battles. Because if all of the battles were won, it wouldn't last very long. We're going to lose battles before we win battles. We have to assume that there are going to be further setbacks before we are going to be in a position to counterattack. And that therefore, we have to think about resilience. We have to think about ensuring the viability of what we have, as opposed to trying to hold on to everything that is being put at risk. That means utmost seriousness in terms of of the putting in place of aid packages from the European Union, the IMF, and so on, but also utmost seriousness in the Ukrainian political class to see that this support is put to good use in order for it to become self-sustaining. Because it is not a mystery that after the enormous crises and shocks which have been subjected on a number of countries in the European Union, notably in the south of the European Union, there is very little public willingness to open the purse to support a faraway country about which people know little, to paraphrase Chamberlain's words about Czechoslovakia. So for support to be self-sustaining, it has to be demonstrated that the support is working. And last, and definitely not least, Ukraine has to demonstrate that it is ready to defend itself. And therefore, I do not belong to those who are criticizing the deployment of Ukrainian forces in the east of Ukraine. It may pose all sorts of problems. It may be very difficult. But if there's one thing which Putin does understand, because he is a seriozny человек, is that a country which is not ready to defend itself is a country which you can do anything you want. And that will be my closing recommendation. Do not let yourself be talked into withdrawing your right to defend your own country.
Thank you. Thank you, Francois. I'm going to ask Karl Gershman to speak now.
Thanks. And first, let me begin by thanking Leon and Tim for bringing this meeting together. I think it's a really important thing that you've done. Leon, you started by talking about the relationship of interests and values, and it reminds me of something that Václav Havel said at a meeting we had in Lviv in 2009, and he said that, if economic interests are placed above political values, it's not just immoral, it's also suicidal. And that, I think, really gets to the linkage between values and interest. And Miroslav Marinovich said something similar to that yesterday here. We have had the return of geopolitics, but it's a very unusual kind of geopolitics because it's a one-sided geopolitics. You have one side playing the game of geopolitics, as you suggested, and the other side is not playing the game of geopolitics, even though, as you've said, Leon, so much is at stake. And as The Economist said, Putin has driven a tank over the international order and wants to reverse the verdict of 1989. But in addition to the fact that it's one-sided in the state context, there is another side to this geopolitical struggle, and that's here in Ukraine. It's what's happened in the Maidan. Because when the citizens' movement of the Euromaidan emerged in November, the desire was to help Ukraine become part of Europe. That is a geopolitical act, but it's not carried out by a state, it's carried out by a people acting on behalf of certain values. And it's quite a dramatic act, and you can say it's what's now precipitated the so-called geopolitical response of Putin. And there's a third thing that's unusual about this new form of geopolitics, which is that if the Maidan and what it represented succeeds, and if Ukraine can actually build a successful democracy, despite all the challenges, and learning from the failure after the Orange Revolution. But if it can succeed in doing that, I think Tim has pointed this out and a lot of others, it's going to have a profound effect in Russia, because it will mean that here you have a successful country neighboring Russia where tens of millions of people speak Russian, and that's what the Russian people are ultimately, in my view, going to want after this hysteria of nationalism passes. Now, in terms of what needs to be done, I agree that we need containment. And I feel very strongly that containment has to have a military dimension. If indeed Putin has destroyed the world order, that what he's doing has global consequences. And if he gets away with it, the consequences of that for the world order are just not going to be regional. China is looking, Iran is looking, other countries are looking. The likelihood of conflict and violence in other parts of the world grow if he gets away with what he's doing. So even though this is no longer the Cold War, where two powers are in conflict with each other, the fact of the matter is that if Russia is not contained, it will have very severe global consequences. So I would go beyond the debate this morning about sanctions and say that yes, you need a very clear and strong military dimension to this policy, just as containment had. And frankly, because that's the only language that Putin really understands. But containment was not just military containment, as we all know. It had another dimension to it, which was that if you contain the Soviet Union over time, the internal contradictions will play out, and you'll have what indeed we saw happen. Kennan called it mellowing. And I think the conditions are very ripe for mellowing in Russia today. You know, for all of Putin's bare-chested bravado and aggressiveness, Russia is a very vulnerable country demographically, economically, health-wise. A young person, 15 years old, living in Russia today, can expect to live 3 years less than a similar person in Haiti. A couple of years ago, the Levada Center reported that 22% of Russian adults want to leave because there's no opportunity there. And that was 3 times more than it was 4 years earlier. So it was growing. So if there is military containment, and if there are sanctions which can intensify the contradictions within Russia, the odds are great that there will be changes and there will be opposition growing in Russia, and eventually Putin will not be there. And that leads, to a second point, that in addition to containment, we need solidarity. We need solidarity with people on the front lines of this struggle in Ukraine. We also need solidarity with Russian Democrats. Today we started with a moment of silence for Crimea. 3 months ago was the 70th anniversary of the deportation in Chechnya. And, it was the Chechen conflict that really started this rise of Putinism back in 1999. And it's where, Putin asserted this new aggressiveness after a decade of malaise in Russia. And there have been Russians people like Anna Politkovskaya who reported on this, and Natasha Estimirova, who monitored the human rights from Memorial. Brave people. They need absolute solidarity. People in Belarus as well. I know there are some here. This speaks to what the United States is going to have to do, Leon, and I know you feel strongly about this. We are going to have to show a new capacity to support not only Maidan, but citizens' movements like Maidan, which are not necessarily as strong as Maidan, but they exist the New Citizens Movement in China, the people who turned out to vote in Afghanistan, despite all sorts of threats that they would be killed. We need to show a new solidarity, and the way that we can do that, I think, at a time when our own populations are very unprepared to do this, is that we have to find a way to connect our populations with what's happening here. Inevitably, in a democracy like ours, people become preoccupied with their own problems, and they forget what it's all about. And if we can strengthen the linkages between people on the front lines of this struggle here and people in Europe and people in the United States, I think that will have the possibility of reviving a commitment to democratic values and an understanding of what this is all about. So I think we have to have a new spirit of democratic solidarity, and there's no better place to begin it than here in Kiev, a short walk from the Maidan, because I think, as Carl Bildt said the other night at the reception, Ukraine today is the epicenter of the global struggle over values. So let's go forward from here and think about things we can do beyond this conference to build a global movement of democratic solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I'd like to ask Volodymyr Kulik to speak.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and very glad to see this happening. And at the same time, I'm a bit uncomfortable about being assign this role of talking about geopolitics because this very notion is very problematic to me, and I start by maybe a bit kind of ungratefully problematizing the very panel to which I was requested in which I was requested to participate. To me, this knowledge is this notion of geopolitics, the use of geopolitics as if it were normatively appropriate, is already kind of a first step towards collaboration with the order, with the world order Putin wants to impose upon us, and that's very disturbing. I mean, of course, we can treat it as an empirical reality we have to deal with. We have to normatively assess and analytically kind of disentangle and formulate an approach toward. Geopolitics is something which Putin wants to impose as the agenda for the new, this brave new world. And he knows the vulnerabilities of his rivals, his enemies. He knows how different they are from him and from the country, from the order he has established in his country. And he wants to take advantage of those vulnerabilities to prevail in this battle of agendas. And I believe part of the game Putin has already won is by asserting Russia's right to behave as a world power. Soon upon, after he came to power, he started using that discourse. Russia is coming back. Russia is a world power, and he has the right to be treated like that. And step by step, the Western world has accepted that. Russia has legitimate interests. Russia has long-standing agenda. Russia has instruments. Russia has capacities. Russia needs to be consulted. Russia needs to be taken into account. We cannot solve this and that and those issues without Russia. We cannot achieve our goals without Russia. Now, this actually has led us partly to what we have. One of those legitimate interests, one of those items on the agenda was to assert Russia's role as the first among equals in the post-Soviet space, and then the only player in the post-Soviet space, the only one to be taken into account. Now Russia is imposing this hybrid war, and we are looking at that in a kind of awe. But what we see in response, as a Western response towards this hybrid war, is what I would dare call hybrid peace, meaning that they are insistent on norms as a guiding principles for behavior in international politics and in whatever responses the West might come up with to this challenge, is combining piecemeally with all insistent on pursuing interests. And the ability to assert norms is constantly undermined by the reluctance to give up, to abandon interests. Even though we see how this is being used by Putin skillfully to weaken the West, to prevail. And of course, democracies are vulnerable. Of course, democracies cannot be mobilized and used as successfully toward one single goal as the totalitarian or authoritarian regimes can. Of course, we have various groups. Of course, we have established procedures. Of course, we have civil society. We have the media. All these things, and above all, we have laziness and kind of enjoyment of life for so many people, which is taken for granted, which is so deeply entrenched, which cannot be easily renounced. And actually, this is also the problem for Ukraine. It's not also the West which is reluctant to abandon its way of life and its enjoyment of life. Also, Ukraine cannot mobilize itself as successfully as it were in the case of a totalitarian country, because Ukraine, without a long tradition of being a full-fledged democracy, has kind of internalized the notion that particular group interests and individual interests are as important, as valuable, or even more valuable than the national interests. And that's why it is so difficult to change it very quickly, to accept the new realities that now we have to consolidate and to regroup our way of life, to accept this national security and national defense as a top, or at least one of the top priorities. Many people who in principle agree with that do not behave in a way helpful to achieving that goal. Also, I would add that what we see in the Western responses to Russia's challenge is remnants or just full-fledged existence of good old imperialism. When I look at Western media agenda, in particular German media agenda, in dealing with what is unhelpfully called the Ukraine crisis, I'm always constantly surprised, annoyed, and frustrated by this old sensitivity to Russia's interests, to Russia's legitimate interests, to Russia's long-standing preoccupations. And what Karl Schlögel talked about yesterday, combined strikingly, shamelessly combined with complete insensitivity to Ukrainian interests, to Ukrainian preoccupations, even though this is happening in Ukraine. This is supposed to be about Ukraine, but it is so much about Russia rather than Ukraine. To me, this is the same imperialist thinking that only great powers, only empires in the final analysis are entitled to this legitimate interest, and not those in-between countries, not those countries which barely exist. They are not countries with real they're not entities. They are not countries with real cultures, with real interests, and maybe not existing at all. So this is something, of course, Ukraine has to contribute to overcoming. But this is also an important issue for the West to take into account. Before the West can decide how much military strength it can acquire and needs to put to use, it has decided whether these countries, these strange places like Donetsk or Narva, for that matter, are worth defending militarily, are worth displaying solidarity with. And of course, these conferences may look like a strange place to preach that. Because here people are doing just that, displaying solidarity. But of course, as representatives, as members of those societies in which this is far from the norm, I believe it's legitimate to discuss it here, to look at how we can change this egotistic preoccupation with our established way of thinking and our established way of perceiving the others, depending on how long they have been around. Like in which case Russia is much more legitimate and important, not just because of its nukes and other arms, but also because of its culture, because of its tradition of being present in the West, which is incomparable with those of Ukraine or Estonia, for that matter. And here I come to my final point about information. Information in the service of geopolitics. Here we also see this hybridity. How modern technologies are smartly used in the service of old goals. How we have internet technologies, internet involvement in established media routines of Western outlets. How that is used for waging these old geopolitical wars, asserting Russian interests in the heart of Western democracies. So this is also seen in how internal battle is being waged in the Western societies about how appropriate it is to take Ukraine into account in this battle as much as Russia. Not even more than Russia, but at least as much. Even this is perceived by a large part of Western societies as inappropriate. And so, finally, coming to what can and should be done, I think here, of course, Ukraine needs to be invited to join NATO. Of course, Ukraine needs to be provided military support. I mean, military equipment. Of course, Ukraine needs to be supported economically and technologically and logistically. But also, Ukraine needs to be supported in terms of reconfiguring and modernizing and restructuring its media landscape to make it more suitable for this new reality, for this hybrid war, to create new outlets, to create new products, to create new procedures for becoming, on the one hand, truly democratic media-wise, but on the other hand, capable of guarding its information security and national cohesiveness, to encourages internal dialogue in the Ukrainian society and also international dialogue with the West to be able to present its agenda, to present its preoccupations to the world. And this, I believe, is as important as as military aspects, as economic aspects. All these sanctions can hardly succeed if Ukraine is unable and actually not ready to defend itself. And this depends very much on this information aspect of this battle. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodymyr. I'm going to ask Tatiana Georgienko to speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will speak about geopolitics here from a particular local perspective. I was born and spent most of my life in Kharkiv, in eastern Ukraine. And also it happened that I studied the Ukrainian-Russian borderlands for quite some years. So in my short talk, I would like actually to address 3 issues, but if I will not have time to address all of them, I can leave the rest for discussion. So first issue is the ambivalence of identity in the Ukrainian-Russian borderlands and the end of this ambivalence as we witness it right now. The second issue which interests me is the geopolitics of memory in the post-Soviet space and the memory of Second World War as a sort of soft power Russia uses in the near abroad. And my third issue is the tension between the project of Eurasian integration and the project of Ruski Mir, Russian world. So let me start with the first issue, the Ukrainian-Russian border, the Ukrainian-Russian borderlands. I don't know if you are aware that actually this is the longest land border in Europe, the border between Ukraine and Russia. And this is actually also one of the most busiest borders in terms of cross-border traffic. It runs through the densely populated and urbanized territories. And this is also the area where Russian language basically dominates on both sides of the border. And this new border, which emerged in 1991 as an international border, has been a challenge for Ukrainian state. And basically, there were 2 main discourses among the Ukrainian elites about the border with Russia. So the security discourse, which emphasized the need to have this border delimited, demarcated, well protected, and this discourse was shared by some experts and actually by the minority of the Ukrainian political elites in the 90s, and the more popular discourse which considered this border as a border of friendship, which should be transparent, and this was also the idea of Boris Yeltsin at that time, to keep borders inside the Commonwealth of new independent states transparent. And of course, as you can imagine, there were no clear-cut national identities in the Ukrainian-Russian borderlands. And researchers who wrote about the Ukrainian-Russian borderlands used such adjectives as hybrid identities, overlapping identities, multiple identities, nested identities, mixed identities, blurred identities, and so on. So, and of course, Ukrainians living in eastern Ukraine, in a way, many of them, they became Ukrainian citizens by default. They accepted this new reality, but in fact, their loyalty to the Ukrainian state was never tested before. And this kind of ambivalence, which existed for 22 years, in my eyes, it's now coming to the end. So what we are witnessing now is a kind of split which emerges in the middle of this Russian-speaking Ukrainian population and people are making choices in favor of Ukraine or in favor of Russia, and this split sometimes goes very painfully across the families, across friendships, and I know it from my own environment, I know it from my friends, how actually painful this process is, and with the Russian military threat, with the annexation of Crimea, this largely Russian-speaking Ukrainian population in Lugansk, in Donetsk, in Kharkov, in Zaporizhia, these people go to the streets to support the Ukrainian state and to support the pro-Ukrainian choice. And believe me, it's not very easy if you are like 200 or 300 people in the hostile environment. But I don't want to speak now about the pro-Russian separatism. I want actually to speak about the birth of this pro-Ukrainian minority in the East, which is at the same time pro-European. And I think this is very special about Eastern Ukraine, is that being pro-European there means to be being pro-Ukrainian means to be pro-European, even more than in Lviv or Kiev. To be pro-Ukrainian in Lugansk means to be pro-European. And actually, in my eyes, from my perspective, of someone who has a lot of contacts in Eastern Ukraine, I think this is the greatest shift we are observing now in Eastern Europe since 1989. And we were talking about the borders of Europe, where Europe ends, where Europe starts. This is about the borders of Eastern Europe, what's going now in Kramatorsk, what's going out now in Slavyansk. It's about where Europe ends and where Europe starts. And these people who go to the streets in these cities, and these people who go next Sunday, go to vote despite being physically threatened and terrorized, they are making this pro-Ukrainian choice and at the same time pro-European choice. So this is the end of the ambivalence for me. So, geopolitics of memory. This is not something new. As you might know, it was already in 2005 when Putin staged his first, very pompous celebration of the Victory Day in Moscow, inviting a lot of international guests. And as I said, Russia's narrative of the Second World War, where Russia is a liberator of Europe from the Nazi occupation, this is a kind of the Russian version of soft power, which Russia promotes very actively in the post-Soviet space, in the near abroad. And I will not give you examples here. You certainly remember the Tallinn bronze soldier case. But as you remember, Timothy Snyder mentioned in his lecture that the next issue Putin will pick up might be the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I have to tell you that in 2009 in Kharkov, we had already a big conference about the meaning of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, organized by the Party of Regions and some Moscow historians and activists. It was actually quite representative landing of Russian historians. And they brought a lot of publications, they brought some CDs with archival information, and the whole conference, which lasted 2 days, and by the way, all these separatist leaders now in Donetsk and Lugansk, they were present at this conference. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was discussed in this context of the Russian vision of Second World War. And this was supported by the Party of Regions in Kharkiv. So we had these battles already in Ukraine. And Ukraine has been the arena of this memory wars, where Russia was kind of imposing its own hegemonic version of the Second World War. And now when pro-Ukrainian activists are beaten on the streets by this so-called titushki, these criminal thugs with the St. George ribbons on their clothes, and St. George ribbon, which is a Russian symbol of military glory, recently reinvented new symbol of the Russian military glory, became a symbol of pro-Russian separatism. We can see this rapid transformation of what was the Cold War of memory into a real hot war, you know, when people were really physically attacked and even killed for wearing certain symbols. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Paul Berman to speak now.
I am one of those on the panel who feel a little uncomfortable with the term geopolitics, and also with the term, or the whole series of terms that accompany the phrase world order. I think that the fundamental dynamic that we are witnessing here is a revolutionary dynamic. And it's a revolutionary dynamic that began in the aftermath of World War II. And it is the struggle against the totalitarian system that survived the war, or later the post-totalitarian system, or what we may now be seeing, the post-totalitarian system. And it is a struggle which has been illustrated most visibly by revolutionary movements, but has been much more than a series of revolutionary movements. By the revolutionary movements, I mean the East German workers' uprising in 1953, the movements in Poland and Hungary in 1956, the movements of 1968, and so forth. The great revolutions of 1989 seemed, to many of us, more decisive than they were. What Putin has shown us is something that he, of course, has always believed, which is that the revolutions could have been prevented. If only Gorbachev had not been Gorbachev, or had thought different thoughts than he did, he could have acted very strongly and prevented those revolutions. Why didn't he? He didn't because the communist ideology had entered a period of decadence, and the communists themselves had fallen into a demoralization where they could no longer take seriously their own doctrine. And they could no longer take seriously their own doctrine because it was, above all, a doctrine about economics. And it was all too clear that communist economics were less successful than the economics of Western Europe. So the communists fell into a terminal demoralization and could no longer summon the will to defend their system. What Putin has done is to rebuild the ideology, not on the basis of an economic ideology, but on the basis of a whole series of things which Tim Snyder and others have described that involve some elements that we recognize from fascism, plus some elements that we recognize from the old communism. The harping on Soviet heroism, which was authentic, of course, in World War II, was the final strongest point of communism all over Western Europe as well. So he's rescued this aspect of the old communism and incorporated it into his new doctrine. And then he's been encouraged in developing this new ideology because in the West, first of all, there was a belief that ideology doesn't exist. There was a belief that it is no longer necessary for people who advocate liberal democratic ideas actually to advocate them. There was the bureaucratization of the idea of Europe in Brussels. There were a whole series of things in which my own country, the United States, has been foremost in participating in failing to recognize the ideological nature of the new situation. So he has acted, Putin, having gathered his confidence, gathered confidence in his own ideology, having recognized that he does have the military strength to act, and having been convinced that if he does act, the Western countries are not going to be able to summon up very much resistance. But he has acted, I think, out of a sense of weakness. And that is because the whole series of doctrines that began with communism after World War II have always been weak, have always been flimsy. A communist society has never been able to remain a single society. All communist societies and then post-communist societies are divided, as in West Germany and East Germany, or Russia and its vast emigration, its vast emigre population, or in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba and the 10% of Cuba that has that now lives outside of Cuba. And none of these societies have managed to be stable. Putin's fear, I think, is that his own Russia is not stable. I think he's terrified by his own reform movement of a few years ago. He has thought that the success of Poland has been for him an extreme tragedy. But if were Ukraine to have a success too, he knows or he fears that this would be the end of his own system. So I think the challenge for us is, above all, an ideological challenge that we have to affirm that there is a society that can be based on democratic liberty, human rights, individual creativity, a society that can be dynamic, that can invent things, that can produce products that no one has ever seen before, a society that can be artistically creative. This kind of a society. We need to affirm that this is possible, and we also need to affirm that in Russia, under Putin, this is not going to happen. And so that he's fighting for a lost cause or a dead carcass of a system that failed in the past and is continuing to fail in the present, and whose failure would be more obvious were it not for the successive commodity prices involving gas and oil and things like that. Now, I think that, of course, the first thing to do is whatever can be done on the part of the Western countries and the United States, the Western Europe and the United States, to shore up Ukraine, to make sure that Ukraine does not collapse under his assault, and to turn Ukraine into as great a success as can be achieved under these circumstances. But apart from that, that's the particular crisis right here. But apart from that, of course, we have to return to a footing of a militant presentation of human rights and of the entire panoply of ideas and values that constitute the liberal democratic idea of civilization. And we have to do this, and here I agree with my friend Carl, that we have to do this above all to strengthen the single group that will ultimately be more powerful than any army and more powerful than any economic corporation, which is going to be the champions of liberal democracy in Russia.
Thank you, Paul. Anton Chekhotov.
Thank you. I will try to share my idea with you about how Putin is successful and why is he successful and what is the mechanism that is at work here. I want to start with a question, and the question is, how do you undermine a world order, or how do you undermine a consensus? I will be speaking about geopolitics a bit later, and now I want to show you a quite a recurrent paradigm that the Kremlin is using. And I want to show you this on the example of Russia Today. Russia Today is a TV network. It's currently the world's third largest TV network. in terms of the audience. It is very popular. It is very popular in the West, and this is the hand of Russian soft power for the West and for the world. And how does it work? Why it is so popular? It is so popular because it presents different opinions, alternative opinions. It is popular because it challenges the democratic consensus, the liberal consensus. My idea is very close to what Paul Berman said, about that after the Second World War there was this feeling in the West that there is no need for ideology anymore. And this, and starting with postmodernists, no narrative was declared to be a final truth. What Russia today is doing, it presents, when discussing some political issues or world issues, it gives a space for a democratic consensus view. But then it adds a lot of other narratives. One narrative may be left-wing. The other narrative can be libertarian. The third narrative can be far-right. The fourth narrative can be conspiracy theory or something. And it gives every narrative a similar time, space in the media exposure. By doing this, it reduces the democratic consensus to simply one of the many narratives, one of the many truths. And by doing this, it marginalizes the narrative. But at the same time, we all understand that Russia today is pushing a pro-Russian view. But it doesn't, by creating these narratives, sometimes these are basically lies. Sometimes these are not lies, those narratives it presents. But in the end, it is the meta-narrative which is behind Russia today. And this meta-narrative is the Russian worldview. So getting back to geopolitics, it is also very similar to what Russia today does. From the mid-90s, Russia was talking about multipolarity. And multipolarity, this idea of having multiple centers of power in the world, is very similar to how Russia today works. And this is why this multipolarity idea is very appealing for people who are not happy, in the West, with the, say, US-dominated world. It is very appealing to the left. That's why the left likes so much Russia today, or Russia at this very moment. It is very appealing to the far right again, because they also hate the US. At least European far right parties and organizations. But with this multipolarity, and with this official anti-globalization rhetoric of the Kremlin, you see that there is actually behind it a Russian meta-narrative, a Russian geopolitical power, and it tries, by talking about multipolarity, it only wants, the Kremlin and Putin's Russia is only wants to weaken the West, weaken the democratic consensus, weaken the existing world order. And when we are talking about Eurasianism, we must understand that Eurasianism is not simply a narrative or a geopolitical theory. It is a meta-narrative. And this is why it is so difficult to counter this idea. Because with Eurasianism, you have a very clear, almost a religious worldview. There is us, and this is good. And this is like good in very religious terms. And the West is bad, and the West is evil. You will when you look at geopolitical textbooks written by university students in Russia, you will still see that this is not a rational theory. I mean, in the West, you will have critical geopolitics, which would be quite rational, but in Russian view, in Russian interpretation, geopolitics is almost like a religious practice, and this is why it is so different to have a counter argument. Just to finish, I think we cannot fight Russian meta-narrative, either in the information sphere, as with Russia today, or in geopolitics, with one single narrative. Because liberalism, democratic consensus was reduced to one of the narratives. We must recreate democratic consensus, to renew it, in order to turn it into a meta-narrative again, as it existed before the Second World War and right after the Second World War. Democracy must become not simply a narrative, but a meta-narrative, and this is how we can counter the meta-narrative of Russia, which is Eurasianism and which is the world domination. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. People who have questions should be writing them down, and then the question should find their way up here. I'm going to ask Mark Kingwell.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be part of this panel and to be here in Kiev this weekend. I've been thinking many things over the last couple of days, and indeed just in response to my fellow panelists today. I'm going to speak briefly and perhaps somewhat more philosophically than some of my colleagues, but there are many points of contact. It strikes me that this conference, but also the very act of philosophical reflection in the political context of Ukraine in 2013 and 14 demonstrates vividly the nature of ideas and action. We often talk about ideologies, we talk about ideas. What is the case invariably is that ideas are acted out by people with their bodies over time. And to put your body at risk for the sake of an idea is, I believe, the highest act that a human being is capable of. We have seen this in your country, and in our own small fashion, to be part of your conversations is a tremendous honor. Because of the constant return to the question of democracy, I'm going to start with the idea of democracy. It strikes me that, especially for those of us who come from North America and some parts of Europe, we have a sense of democracy that lacks urgency. You might call this the paradox of prosperity. In nations where democratic values have triumphed in the form of institutions of freedom and open markets, sometimes the resulting prosperity allows people to take for granted precisely the things that are the conditions of possibility of those actions. And this, I think, is at the root of some of the indifference, I think is the right word, among Canadian and American populations to events that are happening here. We have to fight that indifference. That's our job. But every democratic aspirant, every nation and person who aspires to democracy has to preserve within themselves the urgency of that value. There's a quotation from G.K. Chesterton that stays with me. He says, the problem with democracy as mostly conceived is that the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about decides everything. In Chesterton's terms, we're all oligarchs of that particular sort. Here we are. We can succumb to the temptation to narrow the frame of our reference to just those who are walking about with us, the present, for lack of a better word. But of course, democracy is a tradition that is carried forward from the past and that creates a future. So what I'd like to do in response to the title of our panel is speak to the first two terms, idealism and realism, and try to walk a kind of dialectical line between these and return to where I began with the idea of ideas in action and the notion of the future. So idealism first. One way to think about democracy is that it is a kind of gift economy, by which I mean transactions between people which have no economic reduction. There is no price to be put on democracy. One of the most cynical and yet, of course, accurate and therefore depressing jokes about American democracy, it holds true in Canada too, is that we have the best governments that money can buy. The reduction of democratic process to that kind of transaction, economic transaction, is a deep and creeping tragedy in many nations. So what is a gift? A gift is something that is freely given and freely received, sometimes unexpected, sometimes unwanted. It strikes you by surprise. The essence of the gift economy is that it cannot be reduced to anything other than itself. It cannot be put into price. In real terms, it seems to me that the gift economy of democracy functions best when it is evasive or fugitive, by which I mean revitalized outside of its institutional sites. Things like elections are absolutely necessary for the health of a democratic society, but real democracy happens between people. It happens on the street. It happens in demotic movements that have no institutional basis. And that may leave no lasting institutional structure. They are themselves the gift of democracy from us to ourselves. So the gift, the fugitive, these, I think, are the real world of democracy. This is the idealistic picture. On the realist side, I think it's important to be realistic about democratic movements, and the case in point of Ukraine illustrates this again vividly. I am not of the view that there is a natural right to democratic freedom. I don't think there are any natural rights in that sense. Rights are not woven into the fabric of the universe. They do, however, emerge out of human interaction. We could say that norms, including ethical and political norms, are emergent properties of human discourse. They are dynamic achievements of people talking to each other, arguing, and facing each other, face to face, and experiencing the pull of reciprocity between ourselves and others. That said, sometimes they require acts of will. There is a kind of Nietzschean undercurrent, if you like, to the democratic process. Sometimes it is the coup de main which is necessary. Sometimes you have to put your body on the line. And sometimes force is necessary because when a right cannot be enforced, it's not that it isn't present, but it begins to erode. There is cynicism that creeps in if enforcement is impossible. In 1949, the United Nations, emergent United Nations, commissioned various intellectuals to draft what came to be called the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. A Canadian lawyer, John Humphreys, is one of the principal architects of that document. And it's not for that reason alone that I find it an important moment in history. The Universal Declaration is a document which is much disputed, and quite rightly so. But it is, in my terms, exactly the kind of emergent property, dynamic articulation of norms that is essential for our thoughts. Like Paul and others, I'm not comfortable with the notion of world order, or at least it needs to be problematized. But there are things that we can point to. There are arguments we can make and norms that we can appeal to. And if we're willing to exert force in their defense, they will be real. This will be the real world of democracy. But we have to be so willing. There's an awful lot of not just complacency or indifference, but a kind of open cynicism in the West about events in other parts of the world. And this is beyond unfortunate. This is tragic.
Mark, I need you to...
There are moments when the line has to be drawn. I think it's clear that that moment is here in this scenario, And I hope that we can get our elected leaders to see it that way. If we can't, that will be our failure. It will be their failure. But it doesn't mean that the ideas themselves fail, because every instantiation is a reinforcement of this appeal to the norm. The universalism in the Universal Declaration, again, is not a universalism that is somehow essential to the nature of the universe. It's a universalism that we articulate. It is, you might say, a reiterative universalism. Every time we appeal to it, we make it stronger. Every time we enforce it, we make it more real. So this is our duty as citizens, not just of our nations, but of the world.
Mark, I need you to finish up.
Yep, I'm just there. In French is preserved a distinction on the nature of the future between two terms, la future and l'avenir. And this is my last point. La future has the connotation of a kind of reified future, a future that is coming at us almost like a steamroller, whereas l'avenir is what is to come. We are creating what is to come. The future is l'avenir, not la future. Sometimes, in order to win, you have to fight, and that's democracy too. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. We've heard a wide variety of approaches and ideas. I have a great many questions, not all of which I entirely understand. But I'm going to begin with two of them that are related, and I think they are addressed to Paul and to Carl, and they both have to do with America. The first one, I guess, is the inevitable question, which is, hasn't America discredited the notion of democracy by its numerous actions, and how should the West and the United States rebuild the credibility of democratic values? The questioner refers to Iraq as an example of how we've discredited democratic values. And the second one is, how do you explain the paradox that most Americans do not want the United States to engage heavily in Ukraine, and they do not want military engagement? Obama knows this. His policies seem to be in sync with the popular mood, and yet his approval rating is quite low. In other words, could you talk a little bit about the mood in America and what its strategic implications might be for here and elsewhere? And we'll try to keep the responses brief enough to get to 2 or 3 more questions.
On the first one about America and its credibility, look, nobody's perfect, and as far as Iraq goes, I think Iraq was a very complicated issue, and I'm not about to start apologizing. There was a thought, there was a consensus among a lot of people, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, that there were weapons of mass destruction, and this was a security issue. I realized there were a lot of people who denied that, and it was later proven untrue, and that this was a real setback for the United States, but I don't think that people have reached the conclusion that therefore the United States has no credibility to defend democratic values. There was an article written by some guy recently, a takeoff on the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where, if you'll remember, Jimmy Stewart plays a character who, there just has so many troubles that he really wants to commit suicide. And the angel says, I'll show you what your town would be like if you never lived. And so he takes him, and there's a town that wasn't the town he knew, but a town with prostitution and crime and corruption and cynicism, a really ugly town. And, we're now sort of, the town was called Pottersville. We're now seeing what the world would be like if the United States, withdrew from it. It could be a very, very ugly world, and I think we're only beginning to see the beginning of it. I mentioned in my remarks, I do believe in world order, because if you don't have it, we could really have an unraveling in this world of a similar nature perhaps to what happened 100 years ago in 1914. And I worry about what happens in East Asia between China and Vietnam and China and South Korea and Japan and the Philippines, or in the Middle East, which is such an explosive region. And if the world, people and powers in the world look at the United States and the way it responds to Ukraine and reach the conclusion that the United States is no longer there, we're going to live in an extremely ugly and dangerous world. And I know, Leon, you've sort of said the same thing, that a lot of people who didn't like the United States before because of all, the U.S. overreached and made mistakes and did all sorts of things, are now clamoring for the United States to somehow rejoin the world. I think we're in the middle of a debate right now in the United States about the future. We have a friend of ours, Steve Sasanovich, just wrote a book about the alteration in American history since the Second World War between maximalist presidents and then retrenchment minimalist presidents. I think we're seeing within the Democratic Party a growing concern about the retrenchment. Obama himself has talked about this. And I think we're going to have elections coming up, and I think this issue is going to be debated. And I think the tendency is probably going to be for America to re-engage, because I think people are beginning to understand the consequences if we don't. I don't remember the second, but let me give it to Paul and let him do it.
I'll answer both. In regard to Iraq, I think it was good to overthrow Saddam Hussein. It was bad to do it badly. It was good to overthrow him because he was the worst tyrant in the modern history of the Arab world. It was bad to do it badly for the reasons that everyone can see. The results were catastrophic. The meaning of this for Americans, or for everyone who values the liberal democratic idea, should be a recognition that America can definitely fail. America cannot be regarded as a God that will always be perfect and that will always be all-powerful. And what this has to mean is that we as citizens in the United States and liberal Democrats in the rest of the world have to take on themselves and on ourselves the responsibility to do the right thing ourselves. We cannot expect that some God in the White House is going to come and descend upon the earth and do the right thing. So that's just a basic truth. The second question has to do, asked how to explain the paradox that Americans, a large number or majority of Americans, do not support some kind of action or some kind of a deep resolve on behalf of Ukraine. And I would broaden the question to point out that this is true, I'm sure, all through Western Europe and throughout the liberal and democratic world. And the explanation for that has to do with the explanation I just gave about America's failures, which is that liberal democratic society is not a perfect thing. Liberal democratic society is full of failures. There's something about liberal democratic culture that leads people to the mediocre, to the halfway effort, to the failed. There's a reason why some people are drawn to Putin and his idea of a virile, fascistic anti-liberalism. And the reason is that liberal culture, liberal society does have these failings. And so it is up to us, who are the champions of liberal ideas and of the notion of freedom, to struggle against this. And we know that we're doomed to this struggle. There is no answer to this struggle. The liberal democratic idea doesn't have the perfect answer, just as we will never have the perfect God in the White House. It is always a struggle.
I would add one thing to what Paul just said, which is that there are many reasons for the unpopularity of interventionism or the support for a stronger American position towards Ukraine or Syria or other crises in the world. One of them is so far the constant refusal or failure of political leaders in the West to explain, to make the case to populations for the necessity of engaging with these. There is a way in which the argument for engagement has simply abdicated the field historically in this period. And that one of the roles of leadership in an open society is, in fact, to make the argument, and the argument is not being made. I have another question here, which I'm going to ask anyone on the panel to respond to. It's a very large question, but it's an important one. The question is, what are the key aspects of creating an alternative narrative to the Russian one? I'm also going to ask the people in the back to be a little more respectful of the people in the front.
If I could give that one a shot. The Russian narrative is powerful because it operates at all levels. Historical revisionism, political clarity, authoritarianism, international sovereignism, Westphalianism, social conservatism, religious ideology. This makes for a very complete, very coherent narrative. And in that sense, we're probably not going to have as complete and as coherent a narrative. That's the first caveat which I would make. But the second thing, when we look at the way the Russian narrative unfolds, it is both defensive and offensive. It shows how Russians are being made to suffer in eastern Ukraine, for example. And on the other hand, it demonstrates how Russia is acting to support these poor people. Let me give a practical example of how we should be thinking about our own narrative. One of the components of the Russian narrative is about fascism and anti-Semitism, which are both supposed to be running rife in the streets of Ukraine. We all know that. I saw at least 3 pogroms before I entered this room this morning. That's the view you get from Moscow. What would be our narrative? The first one would be defensive. Defensive narrative is the Jewish community is working with the communities of the other religions and with the government of Ukraine in a total trust and confidence. That's defensive. It's not going to convince anybody, but you have to do it. That's the defensive marker you have to lay. Then you do the offensive part of the narrative, which ties into the historical revisionism of the Russians. And you say, oh, by the way, how does Russia, how has the Soviet Union treated the memory of the Holocaust in the Second World War, under Stalin and under Putin? What is the place which has been given to one of the defining events of the quote-unquote Great Patriotic War? Putin does all of the running with the Great Patriotic War. Nobody challenges him. And for example, you have an attack on anti-Semitism in Ukraine, you can actually use that to attack him on what is one of the key narratives, which is the Great Patriotic War. And when it was said earlier on that this narrative was powerful in Russia and in the near abroad, unfortunately the Russian narrative is extremely powerful as well in the Western European countries. I don't know how powerful it is in the US, but unfortunately, because we simply don't, we are supposed to have invented public relations in the West. This is supposed to have been invented in Madison Avenue. We have entirely forgotten. We do not know how to do these things anymore. We don't take propaganda seriously. This is a propaganda war. And I use the word propaganda the way it was used by the Vatican 100 years ago, or the way most of our governments used it, it is positively 70 or 80 years ago on the eve or during the Second World War.
I'd like to add a few words to this very important question. What we can do to counter this narrative, which is unfortunately, somehow surprisingly, influential and popular, as Anton just very illustratively showed us. I would say there are basically 2 parts. First is to problematize, to deconstruct the Russian narrative itself, along the lines that Francois just mentioned. In all parts of what Russians are saying, there are some problematic assumptions. They are just not always clear, and they should be brought to the surface and dealt with, countered. In many cases, it is very easy to beat them once they are on the surface. But before that, somebody has to do this job of extracting them and putting them in the clear side. And secondly, that brings the issue of media and information technologies. How we do that? How we change our procedures to be able to deal not just with what is already on the surface, but with what is beneath the surface and needs to be put on the surface. And this is also something for Western media discourse, Western media technologies, and also Ukrainian, but assuming that Ukrainians cannot do this job alone. Often, what is normal routine of dealing with the world news, with world affairs, already gives the Russian narrative structural advantage of all these narratives of smaller, non-historical, quote-unquote, nations. And that brings me back to the issue of imperialism I mentioned. With all the correspondence of the Western media stationed in Moscow and occasionally descending on Ukraine, if and when something terrible happens here and not otherwise, or in all other this surprisingly small, so to say, countries between Russia and Poland in the better case, and between Russia and Germany in the worst case. The Western media are structurally unequipped, ill-equipped to counter that narrative. And finally, there is this one overarching value, one overarching slogan which we can use to combat that narrative. For its surprising kind of multilateralism, multifaceted nature, Russian narratives lacks one crucial issue, one crucial value, which is freedom. And we can always emphasize that, and we can demonstrate how, assuming Russians value freedom too, and many of them do, we can convincingly demonstrate that is something their state and their narrative, the dominant narrative in that state doesn't give them. Thank you.
I just want to make one small point. One thing I've been interested to notice in North America, at least, is that part of the reason that the anti-Putin narrative lacks traction is because it's no longer associated with anti-communism. So since '89, Russia is not viewed the same way as it was, and some of the energy that was associated with precisely the obvious violations of human freedom that were part of communism has leaked out inappropriately, but it nevertheless has. So part of the counter-narrative has to be to demonstrate why the current Russian regime is in fact still anti-freedom, even though it's no longer communist.
I want to thank my comrades for an excellent discussion. Thank you for coming. I think the next session is at 4:30, I think. Thank you.